As the speaker kindly said, so my name is Shane. I've been at AIR about 8 years, and I look after the research and client services groups. I've been involved in our earthquake models and our European earthquake model and for quite a long time now, and I'll give you an overview of our earthquake model in Romania. So at a high level, what am I going to talk about? So what I'll talk about a little bit is about some motivation in terms of what's the level of industry insured and to some extent economic losses in Romania. And then I'll talk a little bit about how our models are built. The main point of catastrophe models is to estimate the risk, specifically for our model for earthquake in Romania, is to estimate the risk of earthquakes in Romania by simulating years of activity which have not happened in the past but could potentially happen in the future. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Very quickly, AIR is part of Verisk Analytics, of which my colleague Ted Gregory is also a part. We founded CAT modeling in 1987, so about 30 years ago. Where our head office is in the US, in Boston, and hundreds of companies around the world use our solutions. My colleague Greg Talbot and I, so Greg will be speaking as well this afternoon. We're both based in the London offices of AIR. And then, as I mentioned, we have an office in Boston and various offices in Asia as well as Munich. So, high level. So if you look at a set of historical earthquake events in Europe, you'll see a picture that looks like this. So just take a few seconds and look at this image and then see what you deduce. Well, your eyes will probably be drawn to areas of high density here of earthquakes. So what you see is a lot of earthquakes in Italy, in the regions in Greece, the Greek islands, close to Crete, earthquakes in the North and East Anatolian fault system, and then a few earthquakes here in Romania. So you might then, looking at this map, sort of deduce that earthquake risk in Romania isn't very high. But of course, that's a bit of a wrong conclusion, because this is just showing all the earthquakes above a certain magnitude. So let's zoom in a little bit into this region. So if you look into this region, the map that you're looking at is what's called a loss cost map. It's produced by taking a grid, a regular grid, and putting, let's say, 1 million euros at every point on that grid, and then computing the average annual loss. So what it does is it models each location on that grid, and it says how much would you lose every year on average at each point. So what you can clearly see are tracing several things. You see the North Anatolian fault system, the East Anatolian fault system in Turkey. You see this fault system that goes into the Dead Sea fault system in Lebanon and Israel. You see some high risk around Crete, areas around Athens. And then you see this outlier here, which is away from all the other activity in the Vrancea region, which is very close to where we are. So let's zoom into that region a bit. So you can see a lot of activity here around the Carpathian Arc, and we are very close, of course, to the Vrancea region, where there was a lot of earthquakes in recent decades historically. So let's just see how big these losses could be. So some losses were presented by my colleague in the previous presentation, and I'll show you some ones estimated from our model. So there's sort of three large historical earthquake events we can zoom in on. There are many others, but there are three that we've chosen here. What you're seeing are these losses. So you'll see this number of 12.9 and two numbers of about 3.5, and they're in billions of euros. What that's saying is that if that event were to happen today, so the 1802 event, which is a very large historical earthquake, were to happen today, around about 13 billion euros would be caused to the insurance industry. It's an incredibly large number. And if the 1940 and 77 events were to happen in the Vrancea region again, so this is the 40 and this is the 77 events, they'll be about 3.5 billion euros. And this is to all lines of business that we have. So this is residential, commercial, some industrial exposure. And in fact, the estimates that we have for the residential losses are not dissimilar to what was shown by my colleague from Allianz. So what is this saying? It's saying that there's quite a large loss to the insurance industry that could be incurred. And how that's estimated is by taking our estimate of industry exposure and superimposing it over historical earthquake footprints. I then also want to show you a different number, and this requires a little bit of explanation. So this number is called an insurable number. Insurable is close to economic, but it's not exactly. What insurable is, it's an estimate of all the properties that could be insured. But it excludes a lot of things. It excludes infrastructure, a lot of business interruption, but it does give an idea of an estimate of what number could be close to the total losses of a given event. And so we've done the same thing. So what we did is we said, what's the total industry exposure in Romania? And then we overlaid these historical footprints, and that's estimate of industry exposure as at a few years ago, and we estimated those losses. And this number here of 43 billion euros, which is in the insurable column, is close to about a 250-year return period. So it's so that happened about a couple hundred years ago. It's a pretty significant earthquake event. And you see the 1940 and 77 events cause around 12 billion in this insurable terms that I've explained. So now that I've given you some motivation, I want to dive a little bit deeper. So here's a map showing some of these historical events in the Vrancea region. You'll see the 1940, 77, and that 1802 events, and there were some other events as well. And what we're doing is we're thresholding and looking at large events. What you can see, if you look at these large events, is you're seeing every century or so these are different centuries, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th, and a little bit of 21st century, how many events there are that are pretty large, so about a bit more than 7.0. What you'll see is there are around about 5 events or so every year. So there's quite a certain regularity with which these events occur. And there's been about, in the last 110, 115 years or so, there's been about 4 events. So there's been a few decades since the last fairly large event that's happened. And just sort of looking at where we are, we're sort of in the middle of all that. So now that I've given you some motivation, I want to explain how the models work and what it is that these models are used for by the industry and how we come up with losses. So all catastrophe models work in this framework. Any model you've ever seen would work in this general framework. There is some hazard, there's some engineering part, and there's some financial part. So the hazard part starts off and it says, what are these events, this event generation? So what we do, in the catastrophe model, is we estimate 10,000 years of events, and these events, these years of events haven't happened historically, but could potentially happen in the future, and that's what's in this stochastic catalog. So it creates these events, and it says, so in the Vrancea region, let's in year 1010 of 10,000, let's model a 7.2 earthquake of 100 kilometers deep. That's what it's doing. And then it says, now that I've modeled that event, I don't really care too much about those values that I've computed. What I care about is if I'm modeling this building, how much this building shakes back and forth. And so that's a part that works off of this intensity calculation. It figures out the ground motions at each of these individual locations. Once it figures out the ground motions, then it computes some damage, and that's the proportion of the structure that's damaged. And then once it does that, it computes some insured losses. So it computes deductibles and limits and so on and so forth. And that's broadly how it works. So each slide I'm going to show you now digs into each one in this order. So it'll go event generation, intensity, damage, and so forth. And it'll do this at a very, very high level. So at a high level, and I'm going to talk about the European earthquake model, sort of step out of Romania a bit, and give you an idea of how the framework works and the large-scale motions in Europe. So most of the European earthquake risk is concentrated in this region, sort of southern Mediterranean region, and as I said, there's this anomaly here in the Vrancea region. So European seismicity is largely characterized by these interaction of this Arabian plate, which is moving northward a bit faster than this African plate. And then what happens is that on the East Anatolian fault system you're seeing here, there's this sub-Anatolian microplate which then moves counterclockwise. So it rotates sort of in that counterclockwise way. Because this Arabian plate is moving faster than the African plate, and then there is this East Anatolian fault system there. And that characterizes quite a lot of the seismicity. Not the seismicity here, but it characterizes seismicity in this region, in the southern European region. And when you put all that together, you get something that looks like this. But how do we come up with this risk map? I'll explain it in a little bit more detail, the approach that we use. What we do is we have to classify these sources in some way. And the sources that get classified, so for example, are subduction events. Subduction events typically happen when continental shelves sort of subduct below, oceanic subduct below continental plates, and that happens here, as you might expect, sort of in this Cretan region and on a North African region. So there's some subduction systems. We then have to classify other systems like shallow crustal systems, which are in Italy. These North and Eastern Anatolian fault systems are side-by-side strike-slip fault systems. And then, thankfully, in the UK and Belgium and so forth, you have sort of stable continental regions, which don't usually have very, very large earthquakes. And then, of course, you have this region here in Vrancia, which is there's a lot of debate in terms of how these earthquakes get created. So what we do is we take the whole region of Europe and we divide it. So we take all these historical earthquakes and they're divided into what are called seismic source zones. And seismic source zones are regions of some similar seismicity. What we do is we take the intersection of these regions of seismic source zones and this historical earthquakes, and we create certain statistical distributions that relate magnitudes of earthquakes to their recurrence rates. And we take other information as well, paleoseismic information, and also this is a geodetic or GPS information. And this GPS information I'll explain in the next few slides. It's that part's really quite important, especially for regions of Europe which move a lot, which are more in the southern regions or involving Turkey and Italy and so forth. So let me show you that in a little bit more detail. So what we do is a process called a kinematic model, where we put a mesh across Europe. You'll see that we have a mesh across Europe in this way, and that mesh system, each of these blocks have regions of similar deformation in there. And then what we do is we take the information on this GPS data, so we monitor GPS stations, and the movement in them is very small, on the order of millimeters per year. So we monitor that motion, and we see how much those GPS stations move per year. And you remember I told you this Anatolian microplate sort of moving counterclockwise, and you can see that here. So all that data is very useful, and that's how it helps us to build our model. What we do is we use this information on the motion of plates to get an estimate of what potential strain could be released. So we ultimately then come up with this regional, what we call a kinematic model, and that's shown here. And each of these colors vary from red to blue. And the red, this dark red color is measured in, it's called dynes. They're like moments. And so it estimates force and how much that force moves. And then what we do is, using that information, we create what's called a seismic energy budget. A seismic energy budget is really like you have a set of budget. You have a set of moments that you can release in a certain way. And you can release that by creating one very large magnitude 8 or two magnitude 7s and a magnitude 6, and so on and so forth. What it does is it constrains your historical data, because you only have a certain amount of historical data, but then you create a budget, and you are able to then take that historical data and that budget to figure out how to then release certain earthquakes of certain sizes. So let me give you an example here. This is a Gutenberg-Richter distribution for all of Romania. Gutenberg-Richter distributions, Gutenberg-Richter, they were Californians. This was discovered in the 20s, post that 1906 earthquake. And they essentially relate magnitude, so moment magnitude, to rate. So the y-axis is how many events you have per year. So what this is saying is that you have a bit more than one, say about 2 events per year, which are more than magnitude 5 in Romania. Somewhere in Romania that it has some impact. But what happens is that you have this historical data here. You have an earthquake, the maximum size of a bit less than 8, and you need to then constrain this part of the curve, and that's really where that kinematic model comes in. It's constraining that part of the curve, and it's saying, okay, I'm only going to allow you to have, 1 magnitude 8, let's say. So that's what happens. And then we also have this concept called time dependency. This is not modeled in Romania, per se. This is more modeled in areas of Turkey, in areas of Greece, and also in the Dead Sea Fault region. And I just want to explain the concept, not any of this maths. The concept is really this. If you have an event that's just happened, let's say it's a very large event, the chances of a very large event happening again the next year are quite low. And this is at a high level. If you think about this Tohoku earthquake event, which happened in 2011, which is the Great East Japanese earthquake, that was a magnitude 9. So I'm talking about very large events. So that magnitude 9 event that happened, the chances of that magnitude 9 happening in that same place are quite low. In fact, the Japanese scientists had put that probability at that chance as zero. So it's unlikely to happen the year after that. And that's this concept of time dependency, some of which gets used in certain regions where we have lots of fault information and is not used in Romania. But back to the specificities of the Vrancea region, one of the things that's specific to Vrancea is really the sense of the depth. So it's really quite deep. So this is the region that we're studying. There are lots and lots of events that's happened, and about 2/3 of those earthquakes occur in a very deep part of that subduction zone. And you're looking at depths of 70, 80, even more in terms of kilometers, which is really quite deep. What's significant about earthquakes that are very deep is that they tend to travel quite far. So if you have shallow earthquakes, you can tend to see sometimes some attenuation in smaller regions, but these deep earthquakes in Romania kind of impact the whole country and also neighboring countries as well. On the specificities of how these events are created is not something I'm going to go into. There's many theories which discuss the Vrancea region. One of these theories is shown here. It's during a detached subducting slab beneath this Carpathian Arc where we are. Could be the cause of large earthquakes. We simply use three-dimensional information on the depth and the shape of these of the faults and model it in that way rather than assuming any theories. Once you model the earthquake, so this is where we now go from event generation into local intensity, we then need to figure out what's the motion at this structure. Remember I said it's insufficient to just know about these source parameters. It's insufficient to know that an earthquake is 100 kilometers deep and magnitude 7. You need to know how much a structure shakes. So as an input into that, what you need to do is get this thing called spectral acceleration, which the details of which, again, I won't go into, but I can talk about it after if you like. And what it does is it relates the source parameters, so the magnitude and various aspects of the source, so the orientation, and the distance of the building from that source to the motion of that structure. So you can see this equation here relates the spectral acceleration to the magnitude, to some distance, some site effects, and some other fancy maths. On the site effects, that's a very important part. And so, for example, site effects are, if you have soft soil, you'd expect more amplification than on hard rock and so forth. And you can see all of that here, where you're seeing low site amplification and then sort of higher site amplification in the southern regions, for example, close to Bucharest. So that's the second part that happens. And then the third part, and I'm going to talk about this very briefly, and my colleague mentioned this before as well, is really the spatiotemporal variation and vulnerability. And that's a very fancy word for saying something fairly simple. What it says is that different parts of Romania, there are assumptions on when building codes were enforced and to what level of code. So what it says is that where we are here in this region, of Romania, you can see that there is a more stringent code more recently than there was historically, and I think that was also mentioned in the previous talk. So lots of information is then used to validate the model, and it's used as an input from the model. These are all these historical earthquakes across of Europe, and really you can build a model, but then a lot of it comes down to the calibration of the result. And the calibration will then come down to these historical events and their industry losses that are incurred. You can see a bit more zoomed in, probably more relevant example here. You can see the last 4 events in Romania where there are some magnitudes, and then there will also be some estimate of industry losses. There are probably also some economic loss estimates as well, which could be used. So before I wrap up, I wanted to talk about one other thing, which is really the concept of exposure. So we didn't talk about that at all. So I mentioned, and when I alluded to this idea of an industry exposure database, and I mentioned that you take historical earthquakes and you overlay them over some estimate of industry exposure, and you come up with a loss. And that's really helpful for us. So what you can see is that a high resolution, it's about a 1 kilometer resolution. This is the Carpathian Arc, this is Bucharest. You can see that there is some estimate of industry exposure. For every kilometer in Romania, we either have some exposure or we don't. And we do that for different lines of business, and it's at a very high resolution. It uses various sets of data, some of which is night light data, which is how Romania looks at night from the sky, from satellite information. And that's used for 2 purposes. The first purpose I told you right at the start. I said it's used to estimate industry losses, it helps in calibration of the model, but it's also used very importantly for another purpose, and that is if low resolution exposure is put into the model, how does the model estimate some losses? So you'll see two crestas in Romania here, and what it's saying is that let's say I have very low resolution exposure, for example for these two crestas. I have a very high resolution industry exposure. If I just use the centroid of these two crestas and model it that way, it's not going to give me the best results. So what we do is we have this process called disaggregation, which takes that low resolution exposure, which formerly was one dot in each of these crestas, and it distributes them according to certain weights, with higher weights being on the reds and lower weights being on the greens. And the reds would be areas where you have some towns and cities. And that's really quite a good use of our industry exposure to be able to take garbage, close to garbage data, which is very low resolution, and improve it. We also need to do some loss validation, and depending how far back you go, it determines how much data there is. So there is some information on the 77, 86 events, industry estimates based on ground-up losses. Some of these are also quite difficult, have a lot of assumptions in them. For example, you might only get economic losses, you mightn't get insured, so I think that's why these ground-up losses are here. There are also these footprint validations that can be done, so they are published papers on looking at ground truthing, so that's what these little circles are, and it says what kind of mean damage ratio was found in that region, and we compare the model to the observed. The other thing to take of notice here is you can see that the footprint covers almost all of Romania. Just another thing to keep in mind, these deep earthquakes have very large footprints. So just a few more numbers for you to take away, and then I'll close. I mentioned at the start this 1802 earthquake, which is really quite large. It was around about a 250-year return period, and you can see that here. What you're seeing is an exceedance probability curve. So this is saying the probabilities of losses at various probabilities of exceedance. And you can see here that there's almost nothing at the 5 and 10-year return period, and that sort of makes sense. There are about a couple thousand earthquake events which are being modeled in Romania, and remember I said every few decades, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, you have something big. And that's really why you sort of see this curve sort of increase very rapidly after a few decades. The insured average annual loss is about 0.2 billion and insurable about 0.6 billion. So these numbers are obviously dragged down by the fact that we're dividing by 10,000 years of simulation. But the individual loss amounts themselves could be quite large, as I told you. So 3 billion, 3.5 billion, 12 billion, depending on the historical events. And then the loss estimates can go even higher. So really just to wrap up, earthquake risk in the Differential region remains very high. You can see that it's been quite some time since a significant earthquake, since 77, so about 40 years now. Usually events happen every few decades, so that gives you an idea of the level of earthquake risk, especially considering the time since the last. And our earthquake model is used by many companies across the world for estimating that risk in Romania. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening to my talk.
Thank you too.